Now, you said something earlier about a dream, a vague dream of fixing the healthcare system, which is a very vague dream and also a very grand dream and ill-formed. But I suspect that that ambition has something to do with what motivated you in both directions simultaneously.
Yes. So I did 2 short stints in Washington. One time I worked for the Surgeon General, and one time I worked for the Senate Labor and Human Resources Committee.
When did you do that?
One was around 1990, another was around 1993 or 94.
Okay, place that in your academic career. So.
First was at the end of medical school. I worked for the Surgeon General.
And that was before your internship?
Correct.
Okay, and how long did you work for the Surgeon General?
Just 3 months.
And that was in D.C.? Okay, so you got a taste of that. Okay.
When I went back to medicine, I missed the opportunity to make a change in health policy. So I went to work for the Labor and Human Resources Committee, which kind of oversaw Medicare and things like that. And that was in the middle of my training as an emergency physician. I know this is hard to follow because this is a very unique path. Nobody really does this sort of thing where they zigzag back and forth.
Right. So policy, law, and medicine, fundamentally.
I was very
intermingling
interested.
all 3 of those.
I kept looking for this, but when I went back to work for the Senate Labor and Human Resources Committee in Washington, D.C., I was working for Senator Jeffords, who's an independent from Vermont. And I really think the system was too dirty to fix the healthcare system. That was my conclusion.
How long did you work for him?
Also just 3 months. These were just 3 months stints.
And that was, put that in your academic career?
That was during my emergency medicine training.
After law school?
After law school.
Okay, so you had 2 doses of being involved in the policy world.
Correct.
The second time that you got involved, you just said that you felt it was too complex, you said dirty though.
I said dirty, dirty, not complex, dirty. So
okay, those are different.
Before I worked for Senator Jeffords, I thought politicians didn't get it right because they didn't understand, they didn't know, and as soon as a smart person who's on the inside can advise them, they would be able to fix it. I was very idealistic.
Yeah.
I thought, oh great, I will, I'm a bedside physician, I could help them understand this. No. They understood the problem and they couldn't get the job done. So I was there and I remember they were talking about Medicare going bankrupt. By the way, same song, different year now. And I remember talking to my senator about that. And the obvious solution was to raise the age. Because when the Medicare Act was signed into law, it was, I think, 1965, and the average life expectancy, I think, was 67. Fast forward in the 90s, Medicare still kicks in at age 65, but life expectancy, I think, was 76. Well, they never planned to have 11 years of Medicare coverage versus 2 years of Medicare coverage. People were... Anyway, when you looked at all the options, overcharging wealthy people.
If you're not a coal miner, you're not necessarily old at 65.
Correct. The times have changed. And also the other options of funding Medicare were worse. They were just, make all rich people pay for it, which, by the way, would never have filled in the gap.
Right.
Limit options like you do in Canada.
Rich people are pesky, but they're scarce too.
But they're scarce. That's a good one.
Yes.
Limit options much like you did in Canada.
Or you
don't
just
give
let
access.
people die or help them.
But that was not with MAID, right?
Yeah.
That was not, that's not palatable to Americans. So we heard from all these people, we heard from all these people about ways to fix it. And every single advocacy group that was presenting to us was in favor of raising the age from 65 to 67. We had, Ralph Nader's group, we had the American Heart Association, we had, I think the American Medical Association was on board, everyone. We heard from 12 organizations. And over here, we heard from one organization. That was called the AARP.
Right, American Association of Retired Persons?
Persons, I think. I was unfamiliar because I was young. And that was the only organization that spoke against raising the age limit.
Right.
And I remember walking with my senator and I said, well, obviously the solution is, of all the solutions, it's to raise the age limit. And he looked at me and said, Ms. Gold, do I know what the most powerful lobbying organization in DC is? AARP.
Those people vote.
And my heart kind of sunk because I knew that's the only solution that I could see at that time was just to raise the age limit. And nobody would have it, nobody would do it, nobody would talk about it. And I just remember feeling pretty discouraged that, well, what's the point of my
this is a diagnosis problem. Again, you think you know how a system works till you till you actually investigate it and try to change it. And then you find out that the problems you thought were the problems aren't the problems. And the solutions that you think are solutions won't work for reasons
Correct.
you didn't know.
Correct.
Right. And that's actually part and parcel of starting to think like a scientist. It's like, I read this great book years ago called Systemantics, which I would highly recommend to anyone watching and listening. It's a cult classic, and it consists of about 100 axioms that you have to adopt if you're going to learn how a system works. And one of the axioms I never forgot, which I think is absolutely brilliant, is the system does not do what its name says it does. Right. And so you have to approach a complex system like you're approaching an organism that you know nothing about. And it'll have a name, but that's not what it does. You can figure out quite quickly what it actually does by looking at what it spends most of its time on or its money. So I learned this in Alberta. I worked for Alberta Social Services when I was 18, something like that. I had a summer job that turned into a year-long internship. That's when I got some policy experience. And Alberta Social Services at that time did not have sufficient data gathering capacity to answer the question, how much of the money that we spend is spent on the end user? Well, the answer was very little, because like with most charities, almost all the money spent by social services was spent on the administrators of the social service program. And so, your first pass diagnosis of a system like that is that, well, it's clearly there to employ the people on whom it spends the bulk of the money. Now, a side effect might be the delivery of some services, maybe, but if they're not even collecting data about whether those services are administered, you know exactly how low on the priority list that service actually is. And so you were looking at a system purely from the perspective of logic, I suppose, something like that, and very unidimensionally, not understanding, for example, that the AARP is not to be messed with, no matter what. Right. Right. Why don't they just raise the age a month a year? Would that cause too much? Is that too administratively complex?
No, I don't think so. I think it's just that the AARP was telling the politicians what to do, and so they did it.
Right.
They weren't even messing with it. And that was a huge life lesson. And I learned for me, in my life, I don't need to spend my time doing that. At least practicing medicine is honorable. And so I shifted just back to practicing medicine. Because at least...
Well, see, that's a problem too, isn't it? Because...
You chase out the good people.
Well, yeah. Well, and it's like, to say something on the side of the politicians here, just momentarily, like congressmen in the United States, they spend a tremendous amount of their time traveling back and forth between DC and their home constituency. They are running for election almost all the time, right? So it's like, that's hard, right? Because they're on a 2-year cycle. Mm-hmm. I mean, they're just campaigning all the time. And then they spend, if I remember correctly, they spend 28 hours a week fundraising, right? And they can't do that in their offices because that's illegal. So they have these ratty, horrible offices instead with drop ceilings and fluorescent lights, and they're full of mold, and that doesn't help them out at all. And they're on the bloody phone for 28 hours a week, basically acting as telemarketers for the parties. Well, God, how demoralizing is that? And then, so you have that 28 hours a week, you have your travel, you have your, and that's completely independent of the fact that you have way too much to learn about absolutely everything. So now you're entirely dependent on your staff. All of that's demoralizing. And the consequence of that demoralization is, particularly because they're campaigning all the time, they can't take a long-term view, and everybody who can leaves. Well, so then what the hell do you do about that? I mean, that's you can throw up your hands and leave, and you said, well, you'll go back to medicine because it's honorable. But, it is a real problem when the most competent people can't involve themselves in the government, because it would mean looks like it's the sacrifice of something potentially more productive and useful. Mm-hmm.